My name is Zachary Windwalker, and I am 48 years old. And what I'm about to tell you happened when I was working as a park ranger in the Shawnee National Forest. I'm not one to get spooked easily. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in Chicago taught me that fear is usually just a symptom of not understanding something. Out in Shawnee it was different. I thought I knew the forest, its sounds, its rhythms. Turns out I was wrong. I'd been at the job for 3 years, enough time to get familiar with the territory and the people. The forest was vast, covering nearly 300,000 acres of southern Illinois, and it was my job to patrol, ensure safety, and sometimes just be a guide for the occasional lost hiker. The work was steady and satisfying. It gave me a sense of peace that I hadn't found in the city. One morning, my buddy Garrett and I were having coffee at the station, joking about the time we found a bunch of college kids trying to film a low-budget horror movie in one of the caves. They had no permits and were scared out of their minds by a couple of raccoons. The day seemed like any other, and we had our usual patrols lined up. Just the usual rounds. North Sector first, then down by Trigg Tower. Heard some campers might have left a mess up there, I replied. All right, let's get this over with, Garrett said, downing his coffee and grabbing his hat. We hopped into the old park ranger Jeep and headed out. The first half of the day was uneventful, just the way I liked it. We checked on the campsites, cleaned up some trash, and chatted with a few hikers who seemed relieved to see us. Around noon, we drove over to Trigg Tower, a fire lookout tower built in the 1930s. It's a bit of a climb, but the view from the top is spectacular. As we approached, we saw a man standing at the base of the tower, looking confused. He was tall, with scruffy hair and clothes that had seen better days. "Hey there, you need any help?" I called out. He looked up, startled. Yeah? I'm looking for my friend. We got separated on the trail." "Where'd you last see him?" Garrett asked, getting out of the Jeep. "Near the creek, about a mile back. He said he was going to take a shortcut, but I haven't seen him since," the man explained, a nervous edge to his voice. "All right, we'll help you look," I said, grabbing my radio. "This is Ranger Halverson. We've got a potential missing person near Trigg Tower, requesting additional support for a search." We split up, Garrett taking the north trail while I headed towards the creek with the man, who introduced himself as Lenny. The forest was dense, the canopy blocking out most of the sunlight. We called out for Lenny's friend, but there was no response. An hour passed then, too. The forest felt different, like it was holding its breath. "Ethan, you there?" Garrett's voice crackled over the radio. "Yeah, found anything?" "No, and it's getting late. We should regroup and plan a wider search. Copy that. Heading back now." As we made our way back to the tower, I noticed something strange. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves had gone silent. It was as if the forest itself was watching us. We got back to the Jeep just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. "But let's not stay out here after dark." I nodded, agreeing. We drove Lenny back to his campsite, assuring him we'd continue the search first thing in the morning. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I chalked it up to exhaustion and went to bed. The next day, we assembled a larger search party. Even a couple of Lenny's friends who had arrived overnight. We spread out, covering more ground, but there was still no sign of the missing man. Around midday, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A clearing in the forest, filled with the remains of a campsite, torn tents, scattered belongings, and blood. Lots of blood. I radioed Garrett. My voice steadied despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "Garrett, I found something. It's not good. You need to get here now." Within minutes, Garrett and a few others arrived. The sight left us all silent. There were no bodies, but the amount of blood suggested something violent had happened. We marked the location and called in the authorities. The investigation began in earnest. Forensic teams scoured the area, but there were no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just blood and chaos. Days turned into weeks, and still we had no answers. Lenny's friend was never found. The forest felt different after that. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching, waiting. Every patrol felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. Then things got worse. One evening, just as I was wrapping up my shift, I got a call from a nearby ranger station. A couple of hikers had gone missing near the same area. I grabbed my gear and headed out, meeting Garrett and a few others at the trailhead. We split into groups, determined to find the missing hikers before nightfall. As my group pushed deeper into the forest, I noticed a strange smell, like rotting meat. We followed the scent to a small ravine, where we found the remains of the hikers. It was a gruesome sight, bodies torn apart, scattered like rag dolls. My stomach churned, but I kept it together. We radioed for backup and secured the area. As we waited, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the ravine. It moved silently, blending with the shadows. "Garrett, you see that?" I whispered, pointing towards the figure. He turned, his eyes widening. "What the hell is that?" Before we could react, the figure vanished into the forest. We gave chase, but it was too fast, too elusive. We lost it in the dense undergrowth. When we regrouped, we were shaken. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. The authorities arrived and the investigation deepened. They questioned us, but we had no answers. The deaths were ruled as animal attacks, but we knew better. The forest held a secret, something dark and ancient. As the weeks passed, the disappearances continued. Hikers, campers, even a fellow ranger, people vanished without a trace. The figure became a shadow, haunting our every step. We called it the Tall Man, a name that spread through the local communities, fueling rumors and fear. One night, as I was patrolling alone, I heard a scream, a woman's voice filled with terror. I ran towards the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I found her, a young woman, bleeding and terrified. "Help me, please!" she cried, clutching her side. I radioed for an ambulance and did my best to calm her down. She told me about the figure, how it had attacked her and her boyfriend. She was lucky to escape, but her boyfriend wasn't so fortunate. He was gone, taken by the Tall Man. That night changed everything. The authorities couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. They launched a massive search, combing the forest with helicopters, dogs, and dozens of officers. But the forest was vast, and the Tall Man knew it better than anyone. Months passed, and the attack slowed, then stopped. The forest seemed to return to normal. But I knew better. The Tall Man was still out there, waiting. I left Shawnee shortly after, unable to shake the memories. Now, years later, I'm back in Chicago, working a desk job and trying to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the forest and the people who vanished. I wonder if the Tall Man is still out there, waiting for his next victim. And I wonder if one day I'll be brave enough to return and face the darkness that lurks in the heart of Shawnee. This happened to me in 2000, the summer I lost my wife Sarah to cancer. Not to the Big C itself, but to the chemo cocktail that was supposed to save her, left me hollowed out like a dead tree still standing. Figured a season in Glacier National Park might do me some good. Fresh air, hard work, no pitying looks from neighbors back in Ohio. Emmett Yoder's the name, been a park ranger for 15 years, most of them spent in Yellowstone. But the tourists, the damn crowds, they were too much like the hospital waiting rooms, full of forced cheer and the smell of disinfectant. Glacier was different. Solitude, peaks that scraped the sky, grizzly bears that reminded you nature ain't no petting zoo. The job was simple enough. Patrol the backcountry trails, keep an eye on the wildlife, make sure the granola-crunching hikers didn't do anything stupid. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that lets a man think, grieve, maybe even heal a little. First couple of weeks were quiet, just the usual stuff. A moose calf tangled in fishing line, a couple of college kids trying to summit a peak in flip-flops. But then things started to get strange. I'd find animal carcasses half-eaten with wounds that didn't look like any predator I knew. Tracks that were almost human but not quite. I chalked it up to bears at first. Grizzlies are messy eaters, but the more I saw, the less it added up. One evening I was hiking back to my cabin after a long day on the trail. The sun was dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows that danced and twisted in the fading light. I heard a noise, a low growl that seemed to come from the trees. I stopped, listening, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio on my belt. The growl came again, closer this time. I drew my sidearm, a .44 Magnum that I hoped I wouldn't have to use. I scanned the trees, searching for the source of the sound, but there was nothing, just the wind rustling through the leaves. I continued on, my senses on high alert. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck prickling, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I knew I wasn't alone. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the path, silhouetted against the setting sun. It was tall and thin, with long arms that hung almost to the ground. Its head was large and misshapen, with a pointed snout and eyes that glowed in the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I raised my gun, my finger tightening on the trigger. "Identify yourself!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its eyes fixed on me. I took a step forward, my gun still trained on the figure. I said, "Identify yourself," I repeated, my voice louder this time. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then it let out a low growl, the same sound I had heard earlier. It lunged at me, its long arms outstretched. I fired my gun, the report shattering the silence of the forest. The figure staggered back, clutching its chest. I fired again and again, emptying the chamber. The figure collapsed to the ground, its body twitching and convulsing. I approached cautiously, my gun still raised. The figure lay motionless on the ground, its eyes staring blankly at the sky. I knelt down, my heart still racing, and reached out to touch its skin. It was cold and clammy, like a dead fish. I stood up, my legs shaking, and looked around. The forest was silent, the only sound the wind whistling through the trees. I had killed it, whatever it was. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. I contacted the Park Service, but they were skeptical of my story. They said there had been no reports of strange creatures in the park, no missing hikers, no unexplained animal deaths. They suggested I was suffering from stress from the loss of my wife. I knew they were wrong. I had seen it with my own eyes. I had felt its cold, clammy skin beneath my fingers. I knew I wasn't crazy. I returned to the spot where I had killed the creature, hoping to find some evidence, some proof that I wasn't imagining things. But there was nothing there. The body was gone, vanished without a trace. I searched the forest, scouring every inch of ground, every tree, every rock, but I found nothing. It was as if the creature had never existed. I started to doubt myself, to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the Park Service was right. Maybe I was losing my mind. But then, one night, I was sitting in my cabin, reading a book by the fire. I heard a noise outside, a scratching sound at the door. I put down my book and listened. The scratching continued, growing louder and more insistent. I got up and went to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Standing on the porch was the creature. It was even taller than I remembered, its long arms reaching almost to the roof of the cabin. Its head was even more misshapen, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I screamed and slammed the door shut, fumbling for the lock. I heard the creature pounding on the door, its growls echoing through the cabin. I grabbed my gun and backed away, my eyes fixed on the door. The pounding continued, relentless and deafening. I knew the door wouldn't hold for long. I had to get out of there. I ran to the back of the cabin, grabbed my backpack, and climbed out the window. I sprinted into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the creature behind me, its growls growing louder and closer. I ran and ran, stumbling over rocks and fallen logs. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I finally reached a clearing, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. I looked back, but there was no sign of the creature. I lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I was alone, lost and terrified. In the end, they believed me. They had to. After finding the ravaged campsite, the hiker's remains scattered like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. His name was Tyler something, a young kid eager to see the world. He'd seen too much of it too soon. But even with the evidence, the truth was too monstrous to swallow whole. They called it a bear attack, a rogue grizzly gone mad. Easier to blame a beast we know than the one we don't. The park's closed now indefinitely. Some whisper about reopening it, but the fear lingers. It's in the shadows that lengthen as the sun sets, in the wind that whispers through the pines. Me, I'm back in Ohio, surrounded by the familiar, but I see it in my dreams, the creature, its eyes burning, its claws reaching. I know it's still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness, waiting, watching. I've read up on it, on the myths and legends of wild men, of creatures that walk the line between man and beast. Others say they're demons in disguise, but I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't human. They say it was driven by hunger, by a primal need to feed. But I saw something else in its eyes, something cold and calculating. It wasn't just hungry, it was malicious. It wanted to hurt, to kill. They say it was a one-time thing, a freak occurrence, but I know better. It's still out there, somewhere in the dark corners of the world, and it's waiting for its next victim. My name is Liam Thundercloud, and I am 29 years old. And this happened to me back in 1994. I was living in a small town in Montana working as a forest ranger. The job was quiet, and that suited me just fine. I enjoyed the solitude of the mountains, the smell of pine in the air, and the feeling of being a part of the natural world. It was a peaceful life until that one summer when everything changed. I had a small cabin nestled deep in the woods about 20 miles from the nearest town. The cabin wasn't much, but it was home. The place was rustic, with a wood-burning stove, a couple of rooms, and a porch where I could sit and watch the stars at night. The forest was my backyard, and I knew it like the back of my hand. One evening I was sitting on my porch sipping a cold beer when I noticed something strange. The forest had gone silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Just an eerie, unnatural silence. I shrugged it off at first, figuring it was just one of those odd moments. But then I heard it. A faint rustling in the trees, like something big moving through the underbrush. I stood up, squinting into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The rustling grew louder, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and my hunting knife just in case and started towards the sound. As I made my way through the trees, the noise stopped. I stood there for a moment listening, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I turned around to head back to the cabin when I heard a low, guttural noise behind me. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep, menacing. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows and darkness. I decided it was time to get back to the cabin, fast. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. But the forest remained silent. That night I couldn't sleep. Every little noise set me on edge. I kept thinking about that sound, that deep, unearthly noise. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A few days later, I was out on a routine patrol, checking the trails and campsites. It was a hot, muggy day, and I was looking forward to getting back to the cabin and cooling off. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The forest was silent again. No birds, no insects, nothing. I stopped, listening, and that's when I heard it. A faint, distant scream. It was a human scream, full of terror. I broke into a run, heading towards the sound. As I got closer, the screaming stopped, replaced by a low, steady, growling noise. I reached a small clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a man. He was lying on the ground covered in blood. His clothes were torn, and his face was twisted in a mask of pain and fear. I rushed over to him, but it was too late. He was dead. His eyes stared blankly at the sky, and his body was covered in deep, ragged wounds. It looked like he had been mauled by a wild animal, but something about the wounds didn't seem right. They were too clean, too precise. I heard a rustling behind me and turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the shadows. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I was alone, miles from anywhere, with a dead body and something dangerous lurking in the woods. I radioed for help, but it would be at least an hour before anyone could get there. I decided to stay put, keep an eye on the body, and try to figure out what had happened. As I waited, I kept my knife in my hand, ready for anything. The hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Every little noise made me jump. I kept expecting to see something come charging out of the trees. I heard the sound of an engine. A couple of my fellow rangers arrived, and I filled them in on what had happened. We searched the area, but found no sign of the attacker. The wounds on the body were puzzling. They looked like they had been made by a large animal, but there were no tracks, no signs of a struggle. It was like the man had been dropped there from the sky. The next few days were tense. Everyone in town was on edge, and rumors started flying. Some people said it was a bear, others thought it was a mountain lion. But I knew it was something else, something that didn't belong in the forest. One night, I was sitting on my porch trying to relax when I heard that noise again, the low, guttural growl. It was closer this time, coming from the edge of the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and headed towards the sound. As I walked, the growling grew louder, more menacing. I shined my flashlight into the trees, and that's when I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. They were large, too large for any animal I knew of, and they were filled with a cold, malevolent intelligence. I took a step back, my heart pounding. The eyes moved closer, and I could make out a vague shape, tall, hunched with long, clawed hands. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was humanoid but twisted, unnatural. I backed away, trying to keep the flashlight steady. The creature stepped into the light, and I got a good look at it. Its skin was gray and mottled, its face a grotesque mask of sharp angles and jagged teeth. It had a human-like body, but it was twisted, elongated, with arms that were too long and legs that bent the wrong way. I wanted to run, but I was frozen with fear. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl and took a step towards me. I knew I had to do something, so I threw my flashlight at it and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the cabin. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding. I could hear the creature outside, moving through the trees, circling the cabin. It let out a series of low, guttural noises like it was calling to something. I grabbed my hunting rifle from the closet and loaded it. I wasn't sure if it would do any good, but it was better than nothing. I stood by the door, my hands shaking, listening to the creature outside. The noises stopped, and the silence was even more unnerving. I waited, my finger on the trigger, but nothing happened. After what felt like hours, I finally heard it move away, disappearing into the forest. The next day, I reported what had happened to the authorities, but they didn't believe me. They said it was probably a bear or a mountain lion, and that I was just imagining things. But I knew what I had seen. I started carrying my rifle with me everywhere I went. I wasn't taking any chances. A few days later, another body was found. This time it was a young woman torn apart in the same gruesome manner. The town was in a panic, and people started talking about leaving, getting out while they still could. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit around and wait for this thing to strike again. I gathered some supplies, loaded my rifle, and headed into the forest. I was going to find this creature and put an end to it once and for all. I spent hours tracking it, following its trail through the woods. I found more bodies animals this time, torn apart and left to rot. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The forest was silent, and every step felt like it was leading me closer to something terrible. As night fell, I set up camp in a small clearing. I built a fire and sat with my back to a tree, my rifle in my lap. I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't sleep. Not with that thing out there. Sometime in the middle of the night I heard it, the low, guttural growl coming from the darkness. I stood up, my rifle ready, and shined my flashlight into the trees. The eyes were there, glowing in the darkness, watching me. The creature stepped into the light, and I felt a surge of fear. It was bigger than I remembered, more menacing. It let out a low, rumbling noise and started towards me. I fired a shot, but it didn't seem to faze it. The creature kept coming, moving faster now. I fired again, hitting it in the shoulder, but it barely flinched. I knew I had to make a run for it. I turned and ran, the creature hot on my heels. I could hear it behind me, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, dodging trees and jumping over logs, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I stumbled into another clearing and stopped, gasping for breath. The creature was gone, but I knew it was still out there, watching me. I couldn't keep running forever. I had to make a stand. I found a large rock and climbed on top of it, giving myself a bit of an advantage. I reloaded my rifle and waited. The forest was silent, and the darkness felt like it was closing in around me. Hours passed, and I started to think maybe the creature had given up, but then I heard it, the low, guttural growl coming from the trees. The eyes appeared, glowing in the darkness, and the creature stepped into the clearing. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it knew I had nowhere to go. I aimed my rifle and fired, hitting it in the chest. The creature staggered but kept coming. I fired again and again, but it was like the bullets were just bouncing off. The creature reached the base of the rock and looked up at me, its eyes filled with a cold, malevolent intelligence. It let out a low, rumbling noise and started to climb. I knew I was out of options. I took a deep breath, aimed my rifle at its head, and fired. The creature let out a roar and fell to the ground, thrashing and convulsing. I watched as it twitched and finally went still. I climbed down from the rock, my hands shaking. The creature lay there, its eyes staring blankly at the sky. I took a closer look at it, trying to figure out what it was. It looked like something out of a nightmare, a twisted, grotesque parody of a human being. I radioed for help, and this time they believed me. They sent a team out to retrieve the body, and the whole town was in an uproar. The authorities tried to cover it up, saying it was just a bear attack, but I knew the truth. I never found out where the creature came from or what it really was. Some people said it was a demon. Others thought it was some kind of mutant. I just knew it was something that didn't belong in our world. Life in the town slowly returned to normal, but I could never shake the feeling of unease. I moved away a few months later, unable to live in a place that held so many dark memories. I still think about that summer sometimes, about the creature and the people it killed. I wonder if there are more of them out there lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. But I try not to dwell on it. I've moved on with my life, but I'll never forget what happened. It's a part of me now, a dark chapter in my life that I'll carry with me forever. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods and the forest goes silent, listen closely. My name is Evan Thunderbird, and I am 35 years old, and this happened to me on September 19th, 1994. I was 24 back then, living in a small town called Belford, nestled somewhere in the dense forests of Oregon. I just finished college and was back home, figuring out my next move in life. Belford wasn't exactly a booming metropolis. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. And the biggest excitement came from the annual county fair. I worked part-time at my dad's auto repair shop, saving up some cash while I pondered my future. My folks were great, supportive of whatever I wanted to do, but I knew they preferred if I stayed close to home. One night, after a long day at the shop, I met up with my best friend, Rhett Kinney. We decided to go fishing at Lake Bellwood, secluded spot a few miles out of town. Rhett was a character, always full of jokes and stories that made our mundane lives seem a little less ordinary. We packed our gear and some beers, jumped into my old pickup, and headed out as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Hey, remember when we caught that giant catfish here last summer?" Rhett chuckled, slapping me on the shoulder as we walked to our usual fishing spot. "Yeah, man. That thing was a monster. I thought it was going to drag you into the lake." I laughed. We settled in, casting our lines and shooting the breeze. The night was calm. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. We talked about everything and nothing, mostly avoiding the topic of what we'd do with our lives now that college was over. Suddenly, Rhett went quiet, his eyes fixed on something across the lake. "Hey, Tuck, you see that?" I squinted into the darkness. There was a flicker of light, barely visible through the trees. "Yeah, looks like a campfire or something. Strange place to camp, though. Maybe it's those weirdos from town." We decided to ignore it, focusing on our fishing. But the light kept nagging at me, an odd feeling creeping in. After a while, curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out. We trudged through the woods, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. As we got closer, we realized it wasn't a campfire. It was a small cabin, one I'd never seen before. despite having grown up in these parts. "That's odd," I muttered. "I don't remember any cabin here." "Maybe it's new," Brett suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. We approached cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. The cabin looked old, abandoned even. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung slightly ajar. A sense of dread settled over me. But we pressed on. "Should we go in?" Red whispered. "Why not? It's probably empty," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. We pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from our flashlights. The place was a mess, with old furniture overturned and papers scattered everywhere. "Looks like no one's been here for years," Brett said, rifling through some of the papers. I picked up a faded photograph from the floor. It showed a group of children, their faces blurred and unrecognizable. A chill ran down my spine, but I shoved it into my pocket without thinking. "Let's get out of here, man. This place gives me the creeps," I said. Just as we turned to leave, we heard it, a faint sound, like whispering. We froze, listening intently. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, but we couldn't make out the words. "Is someone here?" Rhett called out, his voice shaky. There was no response, just the continuous whispering. We bolted out of the cabin, not stopping until we were back at the truck. We didn't talk about it on the drive back, the silence between us heavy and tense. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I pulled out the photograph and showed it to my dad. "Do you recognize this place?" I asked. He took one look at it and went pale. "Where did you get this? Rhett and I found an old cabin by the lake last night." "Why?" My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "That cabin belonged to the Granger family. They disappeared back in the 70s, kids and all. No one knows what happened to them." The revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. The whispering, the photograph. It all started to make sense in a horrifying way. I decided to do some digging, with Red reluctantly joining me. We found old newspaper articles about the Granger family and their 3 kids. They vanished without a trace, leaving behind only rumors and speculation. Some said they moved away, while others believed something more sinister had occurred. As we dug deeper, we uncovered more unsettling details. Neighbors had reported seeing strange figures around the property before the family disappeared. The local police had investigated but found nothing conclusive. The case went cold, and the cabin was forgotten. One night, as Rhett and I pored over the old articles at my place, we heard a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Wainwright, our elderly neighbor. She'd always been a bit of a busybody, but this time she looked genuinely concerned. "I heard you boys have been asking about the Grangers," she said, her voice trembling. "We found some stuff at their old cabin and got curious," I replied. She shook her head, glancing nervously around. "You need to stop. The Grangers weren't the first to disappear, and they won't be the last if you keep poking around." "What do you mean?" Red asked. She hesitated, then leaned in, whispering, "There's something evil in those woods. I've lived here all my life. And I've seen things, children with black eyes wandering around at night. They look innocent, but they're not. They're the reason people go missing." A shiver ran down my spine. Rhett and I exchanged a glance, both of us thinking the same thing, the kids in the photograph. But her expression remained grim. "Be careful, boys. Curiosity killed the cat." After she left, Rhett and I sat in stunned silence. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was terrifying. "We need to go back," Rhett said finally. "We need to find out what's really going on." I nodded reluctantly. "But we need to be prepared this time. No more running away." We gathered some supplies, a couple of flashlights, a hunting knife, and my dad's old shotgun. I wasn't keen on using it, but I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. The next night we headed back to the cabin. The air was thick with tension as we approached, every sound magnified in the stillness. We entered the cabin, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The whispering started almost immediately, sending chills down my spine. "We're not leaving until we figure this out," I said, trying to steady my voice. Red nodded, clutching the knife tightly. We moved deeper into the cabin, following the whispers. They led us to a trap door hidden beneath a rug. With a deep breath, we opened it and descended into the darkness below. The basement was even more decrepit than the cabin above. Our flashlights revealed old, rotting furniture and walls covered in strange symbols. In the center of the room stood a circle of candles, long since extinguished. As we examined the symbols, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It felt like the walls were closing in on us. Suddenly the door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. "Who's there?" Rhett shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. The whispering stopped, replaced by a low, menacing laugh. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the shotgun. The laughter grew louder, closer, and then we saw them. 3 children standing at the edge of our flashlight beams. Their eyes were pitch black, void of any emotion or humanity. "Leave this place," one of them said, their voice unnaturally deep. "We just want to know what happened to the Grangers," I said, my voice shaking. "They belong to us now," the child replied. "And soon you will too." Without warning, they lunged at us. I fired the shotgun, the blast echoing in the confined space. The children vanished, but the room seemed to close in on us, the walls alive with whispering. "Let's get out of here!" Rhett yelled, scrambling up the stairs. We ran out of the cabin, not stopping until we reached the truck. We jumped in and sped away, the ominous presence of the children lingering in the back of my mind. Back in town, we decided to tell the sheriff what we had seen. Sheriff Darby was a no-nonsense kind of guy, but he listened patiently as we recounted our experience. When we finished, he sighed and rubbed his chin. "I've heard similar stories over the years," he said, "but without any solid evidence, there's not much we can do. My advice? Stay away from that cabin." We took his advice to heart, avoiding the lake and the woods around it. Life slowly returned to normal, but the experience left a permanent mark on us. We never spoke of the cabin or the children again, but the memory haunted us. Years passed, and I eventually moved away from Belford, starting a new life in the city. Red stayed behind, taking over his family's farm. We kept in touch, but the bond we once had was never quite the same. I received a call from Rhett's sister, Kayla. Her voice was trembling as she spoke. "Tucker, Rhett's gone missing. He went to the lake last night and never came back." My heart sank. I knew deep down that the children had claimed another victim. I returned to Belford, joining the search for Rhett, but he was never found. The cabin remained a dark, unspoken secret, a place where the past lingered and the lost were never found. The aftermath of that night stayed with me, a reminder of the horrors that can hide in the most familiar places. I never went back to Lake Bellwood, and I warned anyone who would listen to stay away. Some believed me, while others dismissed it as a tall tale. But I knew the truth. The children with black eyes were real, and they were still out there, waiting for their next victim. As the years went by, the story of the Grangers and the cabin faded into local legend, a ghost story told around campfires. But for those of us who knew the truth, it was a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most peaceful places. And so, life went on, but the memories of that night remained. I found solace in the ordinary, in the routines of daily life, but the fear never fully left me. It was a quiet, persistent reminder of the unknown, of the things that go bump in the night, and the secrets that small towns can hold. This happened to me in 1960. My name is Ethan Oakenshield, and let me tell you, folks in my line of work see some strange stuff. I've spent 21 years as a park ranger in the Gila National Forest. 21 years of sun-baked trails, towering pines, and nights so dark you could lose yourself in them. It started with the disappearances, hikers mostly. Went out for a day trip, never came back. Then a couple of hunters, their truck found abandoned near the Gila cliff dwellings. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just gone. The Park Service brass chalked it up to accidents, wild animals, maybe even foul play between hikers gone sour. I wasn't so sure. There was something off about the whole thing, a stillness that hung in the air, a prickling on the back of my neck I couldn't shake. Then came the findings. The first was a hiker's boot, half buried in the mud near a creek bed. I remember thinking it looked chewed, the leather ragged and torn in a way that didn't sit right. A few days later, I found a backpack, its strap shredded, contents scattered and half-eaten. The stench was awful. A mix of rot and something else, something metallic and acrid. I radioed it in, sent the findings to headquarters. They said they'd look into it, sent out a couple of extra rangers to patrol the area. But nobody wanted to say what I was thinking. Something was hunting in the Gila. And it wasn't a mountain lion or a bear. One night I was on fire watch duty up in the Mogollon Mountains. We'd had a dry spell, lightning storms cracking through the tinder-dry forests. I was posted up at an old fire tower, a lonely vigil with just the wind and the distant calls of owls for company. I was brewing coffee on my little propane stove when I heard it, a rustle in the trees below, a heavy thud, then silence. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the platform, scanning the moonlit clearing below. Nothing, just the wind rustling the leaves, shadows dancing in the moonlight. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe a coyote. But the unease was back, a cold fist squeezing at my gut. I finished my coffee, kept my eyes peeled. The woods stayed silent, but I felt watched, observed. Just before dawn, I saw it. It was moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing, its silhouette barely visible against the pre-dawn light. Tall, bipedal, moving with a strange, jerky gait. I raised my binoculars, squinting through the lenses. It wasn't human. The limbs were too long, the proportions all wrong. Its head was small, almost shrunken, perched atop a thick, hunched neck, and its skin. It was hairless, pale, almost translucent in the dim light. I watched it as it moved, its movements clumsy but strangely purposeful. It stopped by a fallen log, bent over and picked something up, a bone, white and gleaming in the half-light. It brought the bone to its mouth, its jaw unhinging in a way that shouldn't be possible, and began to gnaw. I lowered the binoculars, my hand trembling. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was responsible for the disappearances, knew it was the source of that metallic, sickening stench. I stayed in the tower until the sun rose, watching as the creature melted back into the trees, disappearing as if it were part of the shadows themselves. I radioed headquarters, told them what I'd seen. They didn't believe me. "Roundtree," a gruff voice crackled over the radio. "We've been getting reports about you seeing things, shadows, noises, hell, you even reported a talking bear last month. You're out there alone too long. Take a few days' leave, clear your head." I knew arguing was pointless. They wouldn't believe me until it was too late, until whatever that thing was took someone else. The next few days were a blur of tension and frustration. I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind, that pale skin, that unnatural jaw, the way it gnawed on that bone. It haunted my dreams, crept into my waking thoughts. I tried to warn people, hikers, campers, even the locals who lived on the fringes of the forest. They listened politely. Some even offered me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. The unspoken question, was old Cade finally losing it? Then came the news that confirmed my worst fears. Vanished from their campsite near the Catwalk Recreation Area, their tent was found ripped open, their belongings scattered, and that same metallic stench hung heavy in the air. This time they couldn't ignore it. The story made the local news, then the state papers. Search parties were organized, helicopters buzzed overhead, but the couple remained missing. I was out in the woods every day, searching, hoping, praying that I was wrong. But deep down, I knew what had become of them. One afternoon I was following a game trail near the West Fork Gila River, my senses on high alert. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. But beneath it, a faint whiff of that metallic odor lingered. I heard a splash, then a strangled cry. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest. Bursting through a thicket of willows, I saw it. The creature was hunched over by the riverbank, its back to me. It was tearing at something, its long, pale arms working with a frenzy that chilled me to the bone. I yelled, a primal scream of rage and fear. The creature whirled around, its face a mask of raw, animalistic hunger. It dropped its prey, a mangled, unrecognizable mass, and stared at me with eyes that were black and empty, devoid of any trace of humanity. We stood there for a long moment, the only sound the rushing of the river and the hammering of my heart. Then, with a guttural snarl that seemed to come from the depths of its being, the creature lunged. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling hard. The creature was on me in an instant, its weight crushing the air from my lungs. I felt its claws rake across my face, hot pain searing through me. I bucked and thrashed, my fists connecting with something hard and bony. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, piercing sound that echoed through the trees. It reared back, giving me a precious moment to scramble away. I scrambled to my feet, my vision blurry with pain and adrenaline. The creature was still there, watching me, its eyes burning with a malevolent intensity. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. I stumbled back to the ranger station, my face a bloody mess, my clothes torn. I told them everything, showed them the claw marks, the blood stains on my clothes. This time, they listened. They had to. The evidence was right there on my face. They sent out a search party, armed and cautious. They found the remains by the riverbank, a gruesome testament to the creature's savagery. The remains of the young couple were never found. The search for the creature continues. But so far, it has eluded capture. It's out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Gila, a nightmare made flesh, a predator that walks on two legs, driven by an insatiable hunger that we can barely comprehend. They say they found footprints, strange, three-toed prints unlike anything they've ever seen. They say they've heard it at night, a high-pitched keening sound that sends shivers down the spine. I'm no longer a ranger. The attack left me scarred, both physically and mentally. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. That somewhere out there in the dark heart of the Gila, that creature is waiting, watching, and one day it will hunt again. My name is Lucas Skyhawk, and I'm 33 years old. And this happened to me back in 1995. I was living in a small town in northern Montana, near the edge of the Blackfeet Reservation. I worked as a mechanic, fixing up old trucks and cars for the locals. Life was simple, and I liked it that way. Most evenings I'd go out for a hike in the nearby woods just to clear my head and enjoy the quiet. One autumn evening I decided to take a different trail. I'd heard from some of the old-timers that it led to a hidden lake. It sounded like a good adventure, so I packed a small bag with some water and snacks, grabbed my flashlight, and set out. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the landscape. The path was narrow and overgrown, but I felt good about it. There was something peaceful about being surrounded by nature. About an hour into my hike, the sky had turned dark, and the woods were getting thicker. The trail was barely visible, but I pressed on, eager to see the lake. That's when I heard it, a strange noise like someone or something moving through the brush. I stopped, listened carefully, but heard nothing else. Probably just an animal, I told myself, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I continued, trying to ignore the feeling. But the noise came again, closer this time. I shone my flashlight around but saw nothing. The air felt heavy, and the usual sounds of the forest had gone silent. I decided to head back, thinking I'd come back during daylight. Just as I turned around, I saw something move in my peripheral vision, something tall and humanoid slipping behind a tree. "Hello!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I quickened my pace. Glancing over my shoulder every few steps, the woods seemed darker than before, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I wasn't a superstitious man, but this was unsettling. The stories of the old spirits and creatures of the land started to play in my mind. Stories. My grandfather used to tell me when I was a kid as I walked, the noises followed always just out of sight. My flashlight flickered and I cursed under my breath, great, just what I needed. I stopped to smack it a couple of times, and when I looked up, there it was, a figure, tall and gaunt, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes, stood about 20 feet away. My blood ran cold. I froze, hoping it was a trick of the light, but it wasn't. It moved slowly, deliberately toward me. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I bolted, running as fast as I could down the trail. Branches whipped my face, and I stumbled over roots and rocks. I could hear it behind me, moving with an unnatural speed. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they were made of lead, but I didn't dare stop. I burst out of the woods into a small clearing. There was an old cabin, half collapsed and covered in vines. I didn't remember seeing it on my way in, but I didn't care. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. The interior was dark and smelled of mold and decay. I found a heavy wooden beam and wedged it against the door, hoping it would hold. I stood there panting, trying to listen for any sounds outside. It was quiet. Too quiet. I found an old oil lamp and managed to get it lit. The dim light cast eerie shadows on the walls, but it was better than nothing. I searched the cabin, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. In a corner I found a rusty old hunting knife. Not much, but better than nothing. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. I sat on the floor, knife in hand, staring at the door. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It had to be some kind of animal, maybe a bear with mange or something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. A loud thud against the door jolted me back to reality. The beam held, but I could hear it, whatever it was, scratching and clawing at the wood. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles white. The door creaked under the pressure, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke through. Desperation took over. I looked around and saw a small window in the back of the cabin. It was a tight fit, but I might be able to squeeze through. I moved quietly, trying not to make any noise. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. I climbed onto an old table and pushed the window open. Cold night air rushed in and I shivered. Just as I was about to climb out, the door burst open with a crash. I turned and saw it, the creature, standing in the doorway. It was even more terrifying up close, with pale, almost translucent skin stretched over its skeletal frame. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and it let out a low guttural sound that made my stomach churn. I didn't think, I just acted. I dove through the window, landing hard on the ground outside. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The creature was right behind me, its footsteps echoing in the night. I could feel its breath on my neck, cold and rancid. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees like twisted, gnarled fingers reaching out to grab me. My flashlight was long gone, and I relied on the faint light of the moon to guide me. Finally, I saw a break in the trees ahead. I burst out of the forest and onto a dirt road. In the distance, I could see the faint lights of a farmhouse. I ran toward it, my lungs burning and my legs ready to give out. I reached the porch and pounded on the door, yelling for help. An old man opened the door, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "What's going on?" he asked. "Please help me. There's something out there," I gasped. He looked past me into the darkness, then back at me. "Get inside quick." I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled inside and he shut the door, locking it and bolting it. He handed me a shotgun. "If something comes through that door, you shoot." I nodded, trying to catch my breath. He introduced himself as Walter, and his wife Martha brought me a glass of water. I told them what happened and they listened, their faces growing more serious with each detail. "We've heard stories about something like that," Walter said. "Old tales, you know. Folks around here call it the Wendigo. I had heard the stories too, but I never believed them until now." We sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of an old clock on the mantel. Hours passed, but nothing happened. Eventually exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep on their couch. When I woke up, the sun was rising. Walter was sitting in a chair, the shotgun across his lap. "You all right, son?" he asked. "Yeah, I think so," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. He offered to drive me back to town, and I accepted. As we drove, I looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the creature watching us. But there was nothing. When we reached my place, I thanked Walter and went inside. I locked all the doors and windows, not that it made me feel any safer. For days I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every shadow made me jump. I kept the knife close and even bought a shotgun, but I never saw the creature again. Life slowly returned to normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, somewhere. I stopped going into the woods, sticking to the safety of my garage and the company of friends. I never told anyone else what happened, afraid they'd think I was crazy, but I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound, the scratching at the door, and I wonder if it's coming back for me. Years later, I heard about a hiker who went missing in those woods. They never found him. It brought all the memories rushing back, and I realized that maybe, just maybe, the old stories were true. Maybe the Wendigo was still out there waiting, and if it was, I could only hope it never found its way back to my door. This happened to me in 1969. My name is Noah Eaglefeather, park ranger for the past 10 years. Always loved the outdoors, the quiet, the solitude. It's in my blood. My grandfather was a mountain man, or so the stories go. It all started with a missing hiker. It wasn't unusual. Folks got lost in the vastness of Yosemite all the time, but this one was different. David something. Young guy, college student probably, judging by the gear he'd left behind. Tent was neat, backpack organized, even a half-eaten bag of trail mix sitting on a rock. No signs of struggle, just gone. The sheriff called me up, said the family was frantic. They wanted to do a search, see if we could find the kid. I gathered a few volunteers, good men used to the terrain. We scoured the valley for 2 days. No luck. Found some footprints leading into a dense part of the woods, but they just stopped, like the earth had swallowed him whole. On the 3rd day, I was on my own. The volunteers had other things to do, families, jobs. I couldn't let it go, though. Something felt off, prickling at the back of my neck. I kept thinking about those footprints, vanishing into thin air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. When I saw it, a shape, dark against the dying light, moving through the trees. It was too big to be a bear, too fluid to be a deer. Curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I followed it. The woods were dense here, sunlight barely penetrating the canopy. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. The shape moved silently, like a whisper in the wind. I kept my distance, my hand hovering over the rifle strapped across my back. Then I saw it clearly. It was humanoid, but not human. Tall, easily 7 feet with long, lanky limbs. Its skin was a mottled gray, almost blending into the shadows. It moved with an unsettling grace, its head cocked to the side as if listening to the forest. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't some lost hiker. This was something else entirely. Something primal. Something terrifying. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the creature. It turned its head, and I swear it looked right at me. Its eyes were black, empty like bottomless pits. I felt a jolt of pure fear run through me, cold and sharp. I ran, crashing through the undergrowth, the creature's gaze burning into my back. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, a small ramshackle thing tucked away on the edge of the park. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I slammed the door shut, bolted it, then leaned against the rough wood, heart pounding against my ribs. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside sent shivers down my spine. The image of the creature, its blank eyes and unsettling grace, was seared into my mind. The next day, I went back to the spot where I'd seen it. There were tracks unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Long, narrow footprints with 3 toes. They led deeper into the woods towards the most remote, inaccessible part of the park. I reported it to the sheriff, told him about the creature, about the tracks. He listened patiently, his face unreadable. Then he said, "Aiden, you know there are bears in these woods, big ones." I tried to explain, to tell him this wasn't any bear, but the words wouldn't come out right. I sounded like a crazy old man ranting about monsters in the woods. The sheriff patted my shoulder, gave me a look that was a mixture of pity and concern. "Get some rest, Aiden," he said. "You've been through a lot." I knew he didn't believe me, but I couldn't let it go. Something was out there, something that had taken the hiker, something that had watched me from the shadows. I had to find out what it was. Days turned into weeks, and the fear turned into a gnawing obsession. I studied animal tracks, read every book I could find on local legends, anything that could shed light on what I'd seen. One day, sifting through old newspaper clippings at the library, I found something, an article from the 1920s, a blurry photograph of a footprint eerily similar to the ones I'd seen. The article spoke of strange sightings, unexplained disappearances, whispers of a creature lurking in the shadows. I showed it to the sheriff. This time he didn't dismiss me outright. He studied the article, his brow furrowed. "This is ... interesting, Eden," he said slowly. "I'll make some inquiries." He kept his word. A few days later he called me, his voice grave. Turns out there have been reports, similar sightings. Going back decades, nothing concrete, mostly hearsay and rumors, but enough to warrant a closer look. He'd contacted the Park Service, requested additional resources. A team of rangers arrived from out of state, men and women with years of experience tracking wildlife. They brought with them equipment, cameras, motion detectors. This wasn't a search and rescue anymore. It was an investigation. We set traps, cameras, covered miles of terrain. Weeks went by, and the tension in the air grew thicker. The other rangers, at first skeptical, started to share my unease. The woods felt different, heavier, as if something was watching us from the shadows. Then, one night, it happened. One of the cameras deep in the woods caught something. A fleeting glimpse, a blur of movement in the darkness. But it was enough. It was the creature, its long limbs and hunched back unmistakable. The next morning we found one of the rangers, Sarah, lying dead by the stream. Her body was mangled, twisted at an unnatural angle, her eyes wide with terror. It was a sight that would stay with me forever, a testament to the raw, primal savagery of the thing we were dealing with. The news spread like wildfire. Fear gripped the valley. Tourists fled. The park was closed indefinitely. The search for the creature intensified, but it was like chasing a ghost. It left no trace, only a chilling silence in its wake. We never caught it, never even got a clear shot of it. The search was eventually called off, resources reallocated, the park reopened, albeit with a heavy sense of unease hanging over it. Years have passed and the memories haven't faded. I still walk those woods, but I always keep my eyes open, my senses alert. The creature is out there somewhere, a shadow lurking in the deepest corners of the park. I don't know what it is, where it came from, what it wants, but I know it's real. I saw it, and Sarah paid the price for our ignorance. The sheriff believed me in the end. Sarah's death was proof enough. We never found the hiker, David. I think I hear it moving through the trees, a whisper in the darkness, and I wonder if it's watching me. Its black eyes boring into my soul, waiting for its next chance.